Despite recent attempts to question the validity of religion's role during the founding era, the primary documents written by the fathers speak for themselves. To be certain, there was not complete agreement amongst the founders on any one topic, including that of their personal faith. From the charismatic orator Patrick Henry, whose faith, according to his biographer, quote, was his guiding principle in both his political and private life, end quote, to Dr. Thomas Young, who at one point was tried for blasphemy and who, according to Pauline Maier, held to a loose version of Christianity that was, quote, at best radically unorthodox, end quote. The founders had personal beliefs as diverse as the colonies from which they came. Although such differences were present, Mark Knoll maintains that the Christian values played a central part in the tumultuous events of the Revolutionary period, end quote. But what does Christian values mean exactly? In his book, Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers, Daniel Dreisbach investigates one verse that seems to capture the very meaning of what the Founder Fathers meant by Christian values. Micah 6:8 reads, "He hath shown thee, O man, what is good and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." Components of that verse are found throughout the writings of multiple founding fathers, including that of George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and even Thomas Young. What is it about this verse that resonated so much amongst the founders? Dreisbach contends that if you're going to understand this verse, it must be understood within the context of which it was written. The theme throughout the 7 chapters of Micah is justice, which is why Dreisbach presents the verse as if it was part of a courtroom hearing. The plaintiff is God, who has provided for the safety and daily needs of the defendant, the people of Israel, who, once again, have turned their backs on his commandments. Through the liberation in the courtroom, verses 1 through 7, the Hebrews realize that they have sinned and are asking what they could do differently. And in almost a moment of frustration, Micah, the lawyer, spells it out for them again. What is required of them can be summarized in 3 actions: do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. If then individuals adopt this as their own personal creed, then the nation as a whole will be functioning within the will of God. This was the goal of the founders, as they fully believed Winthrop's sermon that America had indeed been set apart as a city upon a hill. They knew that the country that they were attempting to set up was different than anything that the world had ever seen. They were determined to create a society where the people would be free from tyrannical rule. But within that freedom, there needed to be an underlying code that would allow for common decency. John Adams wrote in his diary that if a nation took, quote, the Bible for their only law book, and every member should regulate his conduct by the precepts that were exhibited, every member would be obliged in a conscience to temperance, frugality, and industry, to justice, kindness, and charity towards his fellow man, and piety, love, and reverence towards the Almighty God, end quote. It is clear that Adams was aware of Micah 6:8 and understood that a personal commitment to those principles would create a nation that would be, in his words, a utopian paradise. It is, after all, the citizens of a country that creates the national state of mind, which is why, when George Washington was preparing to hand in his resignation as the commander of the Continental Army, he included what he believed to be, in his farewell address, quote, "I now make it my earnest prayer that God would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion, and without an humble imitation of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation," end quote. Dreisbeck maintains that Washington, along with the other founding fathers, believed that a self-governing nation's only hope of success is if the citizens were intentional in their virtuous duties and were self-controlled. Only then would that spirit transcend to those in authority, holding the nation firmly within the grasp of God's pleasure. This verse, they believed, went further than just a guidepost for an individual citizen. It was a manual for the moral and ethical conduct of the nation. If a nation abandons virtue and ignores justice, mercy, and humility, then, as Washington warns, it is setting itself up for self-ruin. Just as its citizens can spread virtue from the ground up, it too can spread wickedness. The founding fathers feared what would happen to the country if instead of justice, dishonesty, corruption, and prejudice were spread, or if instead of mercy, malevolence, ruthlessness, and cruelty were loved. Likewise, what if instead of being humble, citizens walked with an air of self-centered conceit, arrogance, and pretentious attitudes? What then would become of the country that they had fought so hard to create? The thought terrified them, so they did what they could to ensure that America would be seen as a free land full of hope. Their vision was not perfect. They acknowledged that, but it allowed for the opportunity for its citizens to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly in order to set the country on the path for true freedom for everyone. Imagine a country whose citizens would courageously and intentionally embrace the components of Micah 6:8, thereby forcing their government to do the same. That is what the founders had in mind, a country full of justice, mercy, and humility.